You ready to meet my family? It's not all my family. This is just my father's side and only goes back a few generations. And just bear with me. I promise there's a method to this. But we start with a World War I veteran named Howard Quirt. That is basically squirt without the S. And he ended up being a newspaper guy. He ended up being editor-in-chief of the Marshfield, Wisconsin newspaper, town newspaper called the Gazette, I think. Married a beautiful woman named Lila Quirt. And they had three beautiful daughters, my Aunt Margie, my Aunt Barb, and my grandmother, whose name was Audley. Aunt Margie married an insurance guy named Bob. And they had my cousin Barb, who is now a Unitarian minister in Princeton, New Jersey, and my cousin Ellen, who is a clown. Well, was a clown, like classically trained, like went to clown school, was awesome at it, and then kind of branched out. And now she does all kinds of cool things, like I think she ran a clinic at one point for like burned out executives to help them, like, I don't know, rediscover their passion. Anyway, very cool. She's always the one who like organizes the skits at the family reunions. Fun. Anyway, let's see. Barb married an astrophysicist named Rob. They have two children named Eric and Arthur. Okay, so Barb married the best fisherman I've ever seen in my life. You could just look at the water and the fish would jump into the boat. Not really, but coincidentally, his first name was Rod. Barb and Rod had my cousin Steve and my cousin Chris, who had three children from Steve and Nika, kind of a Southern Belle type. Nika is Brian, Andy, and Chance, and then Chris has Amy and Anna. Now, my grandma married an Italian, like off the boat. His name was Donato Achille Santercole. But he wanted a good job, and he wanted to be a banker. He was good with numbers, and you couldn't get a job like that if you had an ethnic-sounding name. So Donato Achille Santercole became Donald A. Sandro. My name is basically dumbed down Italian. Don Audley had, of course, my uncle and my dad. My dad married my mom and had me, and I got the two little ruffians at home. Anyway, point of all this, I promise there's a point. Here's the point. If you look at my dad and my uncle, you would be able to tell they were related. Physically, you can tell. And you could tell that they were more like each other than either of them is like my cousin Ellen, even without the face paint. And if you measured their DNA would be more alike, would have more similarities. You know, run the DNA fingerprint on the electrophoresis, there'll be more bars in common than there would be with her. You agree? Why? Why is that? Why are they more alike than either of them is like the clown? Because they have the same parents. Okay, let's try this again. If you look at Brian and Anna, you could tell that they were related and have facial similarities you'd be able to spot. You know what to look for. And they look more like each other than either of them does like me. And if you measure their DNA, you will find more similarities between them than you would between them and me. Why?
Because their common ancestor is closer than your common ancestor.
And who would that common ancestor be?
With you and them would be your grandmother, and with them it'd just be your aunt Barb.
So for them, the closest common ancestor is Aunt Barb. They have the same grandparents. But I like that you said common ancestor. It's a good way to put it, because to find their common ancestor with me, you got to go back to the great grandparents. Does everybody agree with that? Can we make a general rule that says basically the more recently two humans have had their common ancestor, the more alike they are genetically? That sounds like an accurate blanket statement we can make? Don't write it down. No brainer, right? Okay, well, you basically just articulated the first big idea of this dude. That would be Charles Darwin. Chapter 16 is largely about his work. We're not going to spend nearly as much time focusing on him because modern evolutionary theory has come a long way. But he had two really big ideas that have stuck big time. And the first of them was what we just talked about. Before we get into that first big idea, this is chapter 16. Go ahead and start writing. And this sort of a callback to our very first characteristics of life that we talked about. Remember that evolution is change. Specifically, evolution is change in living populations over time. And the kind of change that evolution really technically refers to is genetic change. Genetic change in living populations over time. A change in the gene pool. That's all evolution is. Evolution just happens. We've never seen a living population that doesn't do it. The interesting part is how it happens. The mechanisms of evolution are where we're going. Understanding how this works is key to really understanding biology. Famous guy named Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. You don't have to write that down, but it's true. It's true. Understanding evolution helps you pull everything else together and helps you learn everything else more thoroughly. So that change that we're talking about, we know it happened because of fossils, of course. That's where everybody kind of goes first, is to the fossil record. Hey, look, there's stuff that lived that doesn't live here anymore. That's change, sure. What's cool, though, is that at this point, we've known about evolution for long enough to actually be able to keep track and watch it happen in living populations, which is cool. The shorter the lifespan, of course, of the living thing, the easier it is to watch evolution happen. So bacteria, viruses, insects, prime candidates to watch evolution happen in real time. But we're finding out that it actually happens faster than we thought in animals as well. Adorable old British couple named Peter and Rosemary Grant have watched the Galapagos finches evolve over the last 50 years. And in fact, it only took about 5 years for them to see real evolution start happening. And the other thing to note is, even though this is, Darwin's theory of evolution is the name of chapter, evolutionary theory is kind of ironically an evolving thing itself. Remember that theories, although they're kind of the endpoints of science, it's not like you get above theory, but you modify your theories as new data comes. And boy, does new data come on evolution. We haven't found all the fossils yet. So when we find new fossils, evolutionary theories have to be modified. So when we talk about evolutionary theory, we're talking about modern evolutionary theory, but it's a theory that still includes Darwin's two biggest ideas. And the one you just saw in action with my family, that first, maybe biggest idea, it's not the one that you've already learned. What's the evolutionary mechanism you've already learned about? Natural selection. Absolutely. We'll do that one second, since that's the one you know better. The first one, maybe the biggest one, is this. Notice that all I did was change the word human to the word species. And it's exactly what we showed with my family. The more recently two species have shared their common ancestor, the more alike they are genetically. To put it crudely, what this basically says is as soon as you last had your common ancestor, branches of a family tree start getting differenter and differenter. Not a word, but I like it, right? That change, it's descent with modification because of crossing over and independent assortment, right? Because every time you reveal genes from your parents, you shuffle them up first. That means branches of family trees keep getting more and more different from each other. It's true of humans. It's true of everything. And so what's cool about this when you start to really think about how you can use it is, well, okay, if that's true and there's a fairly steady rate of genetic change, all we got to do is measure how similar your DNA is. And we know how long ago you had your common ancestor. It's true of humans. It could be true of anything. And so Darwin takes this idea and runs with it. Says, all right, well, if it's true of humans, it's true of everything, we ought to be able to make a family tree of life, right? We ought to be able to trace common ancestors all the way back. What we just did for my family, we ought to be able to do in a very similar way to, I don't know, bears. Brown bear and black bear, American black bear. That's like my dad and my uncle, right? You can tell they're related. They're obviously both bears. I mean, one of them you'd way rather meet in the wild than the other. One of them, it's just make loud noises and wave your arms and they'll probably run away. And the other one, run because it's going to eat you. Or play dead or whatever the advice, I don't know. They're really scary though. But yeah, you can tell that they're related. And you can tell that they're more like each other than either of them is like that fool over there. Look at that thing. Just sitting there with a branch. It's a bear. Not as much of a bear, right? Like you can tell that it's more different than those two than they are than each other. And if you measure the DNA, you get the same story. And that's because their common ancestor is more recent than their common ancestor with the panda. And we can actually quantify that, right? We can measure those differences and say, hey, this much genetic difference correlates to, I don't know, about 7 million years ago having a common ancestor. Whereas this much genetic difference, that goes all the way back to like 22 million years ago. We call it a molecular clock, and you'll work with one very soon. You get it? That's descent with modification. That is Darwin's first big idea. Super powerful and kind of deceptively simple. The more recently, look at raccoons. Didn't know they'd make the list, did you? And look how much it looks like a lesser panda. But yeah, even further back for raccoons, right? So the more recently two species have shared a common ancestor, the more alike they are genetically. Any questions? Mm-hmm. Cool. Guided reading coming at you. A reminder that your bioethics paper was due today. Worth turning in if you haven't.